Hello everyone. In this video I would like to discuss George Herbert and his poetry. George Herbert's dates are 1593 to 1633, a sobering reminder that in the 17th century life expectancy could be pretty short. We could say that in his case George Herbert lived to the ripe old age, as it then would have been, of 40 years old. Herbert was born into a very well-to-do family which was located on an estate, roughly speaking, I suppose, where Sir Bertilac's castle in Sir Gawain the Green Knight would have been if Sir Bertilac had ever really existed. Herbert's family did exist, obviously. His mother, Lady Magdalen Herbert, was a friend and patron of John Donne, and in fact it was to her house reportedly that Donne was heading on the occasion recorded in his poem Good Friday 1613, Riding Westward. George Herbert received a very good education, as one might suppose, went to the University of Cambridge, graduated from the University of Cambridge, and became university orator, a position which meant that he had to deliver lectures on important ceremonial occasions. Usually these lectures would have been delivered in Latin. Herbert was happy with this appointment because in the past that had been a springboard to a good political career at the court of the king. However, for whatever reason, this was not to be Herbert's fate, though he very much wanted to have an important political position. Eventually, George Herbert took holy orders, and in the last year or two of his life became a priest in the very small country church in the south of England called Bemerton. At this church, George Herbert apparently lived an exemplary life of a priest, caring for the spiritual and, in fact, the physical needs of his parishioners. In many ways, I think George Herbert can be seen as a true living exemplar of the kind of person that Chaucer gives us a glimpse of in his portrait of the parson in the general prologue of the Canterbury Tales. What George Herbert did as a hobby apparently was write poems. He never published these during his lifetime as a book, but on his deathbed he asked his good friend Nicholas Ferrar, a wealthy Englishman with a large landed estate, that Ferrar had turned into a kind of religious retreat where people would go and pray and meditate on the scriptures in a communal setting, and then in their free time would minister to the needs of the poorer folk of the neighborhood. George Herbert asked Nicholas Ferrar whether or to take a look at these poems, and if Ferrar thought that they could be of spiritual benefit to people, have them published, and if Ferrar did not think very highly of the poems, to have them burned. Fortunately, Nicholas Ferrar thought highly enough of these poems to have them published in the year 1633, the same year that John Donne's poems were published, all collected together in a volume entitled The Temple. All of George Herbert's poems are religious in nature, and all of them focus around the theme of the church, hence the title of this book, The Temple. It consists of several hundred short lyric poems, relatively short lyric poems, and all of them are focused, as its name indicates, on a physical feature of a church or an idea that is of central importance to Christianity. And so we begin our discussion of George Herbert's poetry by looking at his very famous poem, The Altar. You notice immediately what's striking about The Altar is that it is what we call a shaped poem. The poem itself looks like an altar being that ceremonial table that was used by the Jews in their worship, primarily in Old Testament times, upon which animals would be sacrificed. Christianity has taken over the notion of an altar, and it has become sort of the focal point of a Christian church. And in the old Catholic religion and in the Anglican faith that Herbert belonged to, what takes place on the altar is the sacrifice of the commemoration of Christ's sacrifice on the cross there as embodied in Holy Communion. What George Herbert is telling us in this poem is that his altar that he is creating, that he is raising up, is this poem. When George Herbert refers to the altar in this poem, he means evidently the poem itself, because the poem is in the shape of an altar. A broken altar, Lord, thy servant rears, made of a heart and cemented with tears, whose parts are as thy hands did frame, no workman's tool hath touched the same. A heart alone is such a stone as nothing but thy power doth cut. Wherefore each part of my hard heart meets in this frame to praise thy name, that, if I chance to hold my peace, these stones to praise thee may not cease. O let thy blessed sacrifice be mine, and sanctify this altar to be thine. So what Herbert gives us here is a picture of what it means for him to be a poet. The poet creates a poem, and this poem is an altar. And as I mentioned before, what took place on the altar in Old Testament Jewish worship is sacrifice. So for George Herbert, this altar, this writing of a poem, is sacrifice. If any of you have written poems and tried hard to write poems with a certain kind of rhyme scheme, a certain kind of metrical scheme, and tried really hard to make it a good poem that will speak to a lot of people, you'll know that it's a difficult task indeed. And since George Herbert is dedicating himself to this task, not for his own praise, but for the praise of God, then it becomes his sacrifice for the benefit of another, for God, and for the readers who will be helped spiritually by reading the poem. Notice that George Herbert speaks of his own work not terribly highly. This is a good example of George Herbert's very well-known humility. He does not think, apparently, very highly of himself as a poet. What he does say is that his poems are straightforward from the heart and are therefore sincere expressions of love and devotion for God. This is why he says, a broken altar, Lord. If the altar is the poem, then the poem is broken. It's not a very good piece of work. A broken altar, Lord, thy servant rears, that is, raises up, made of a heart and cemented with tears. So it's difficult, it's hard work to write good poetry, but he's going to do it as a service to God. Whose parts are as thy hands did frame. So God's hand made the parts of the altar. If the altar is the poem, then the parts of it are the words that make it up. So he's taking the words as he finds them in the language, essentially created as they are by God, and taking that divine language, arranging those words so that it will express praise to God. Whose parts are as thy hands did frame, no workman's tool hath touched the same. Again, gesture of humility here on George Herbert's part. This is not a carefully worked, highly polished poem. No workman's tools have touched this poem. George Herbert does not consider himself a great craftsman. He has not carefully and thoroughly worked this poem. I might say here, too, that lines 3 and 4 are an allusion to early books in the Old Testament when the children of Israel are becoming a nation. When God commands them to raise altars, he very often tells them to raise altars without hewing, polishing, carving the stones, but to stack the stones as they find them and to make a very rough table, a very rough platform indeed. And the reason for that is that the other pagan religions that God frowned upon often had very highly elaborate and decorative altars. But here, George Herbert is following the Old Testament tradition of a very simple altar, and once again showing that this poem is simple, is not a particularly well-worked piece of literature. He goes on to say, in the narrow portion of the poem, the iambic dimeter, we might say, 2 iambs per line, da-dum, da-dum, in that iambic dimeter portion of the poem, which forms, as it were, the kind of stem between the top of the altar and its base. A heart alone is such a stone as nothing but thy power doth cut. Herbert here is referring to an idea that you often read, for instance, in the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah, that the children of Israel have a heart of stone. It's very hard and unresponsive to God, so only God can cut out that heart and replace it with a heart of flesh. So since Herbert is talking about altars and stones, this puts him in mind of the stony heart that a sinner has that has to be replaced by a heart that's capable of loving God. And once again, speaking of himself as this kind of sinner, only God's power is able to save a human being and change the human heart. Wherefore each part of my hard heart meets in this frame to praise thy name. This frame, obviously, is the shape of the altar, and so the purpose of the altar is to express straight from George Herbert's heart, with sincerity, praise for God. And he goes on to say that if he should fall silent, that if I chance to hold my peace, these stones to praise thee may not cease. A reference to the Gospel of Luke that at a particular point when Christ was being praised by bystanders, his disciple getting a bit embarrassed, asking Christ to tell them to be quiet. Christ said he would not. If he told these people to be quiet, the very stones of the ground would cry out and praise for God. So Herbert says that if I become quiet, if I fall silent, that is, if I should die, this poem of the altar and all of these poems in the collection called The Temple would continue to praise God even after Herbert's death. Oh, let thy blessed sacrifice be mine, and sanctify this altar to be thine. So he, speaking of altars and sacrifice, he's very well aware that the altar in a church commemorates Christ's sacrifice on the cross, undertaken for the benefit of man. So George Herbert wants to seize on that. He wants to accept Christ's sacrifice and apply it to his own heart. And in exchange, then, he wants God to accept the sacrifice of this poem, and he wants God to sanctify it or make it holy so that its praise can benefit other people. And notice, by the way, at the very end of the poem, the rhyme of mine and thine, bringing together me and you, bringing together the speaker of the poem and God, bringing together human beings and God. That's always what's uppermost in Herbert's mind. He uses this kind of trick, sorry, I shouldn't say trick, but he uses this kind of device several times in his poetry, where God and man are separate, but by the end of the poem he manages to work them close together, either by rhyme or by some other way. I might say, too, about this poem, it's written roughly 400 years ago now, and the language has changed in that time. Let me point out that at the very end of line 1, the word rears, which means to raise up, as we still use it, to rear a child, to raise up, entirely appropriate here for the construction of an altar, which one builds from the ground up, but also in George Herbert's day it meant to raise a noise by shouting. Right, and so we're reminded at the end of the poem that Herbert says that if he should fall silent, this altar would continue to praise God. So, and also, pay attention to to words that we think we understand that may seem deceptively simple. When he says that my hard heart meets in this frame to praise thy name, hard here, difficult to understand. Right, we still use the word in this sense. This concept that I've learned in math today is hard. It's difficult to understand, but hard also means unyielding, hard to penetrate with the understanding. So, in this sense, unyielding or not responsive to God and His love. Herbert always has to be on guard against that, hoping that God will take out his stony heart and replace it with a heart of flesh. So we could cast our eyes over, I won't spend much time on it, to look at Easter Wings, which is another shaped poem from this collection. Notice that here what the device Herbert is using is working on lengths of line. So the first and last line of each stanza are an iambic pentameter, but each subsequent line gets shorter and shorter, iambic tetrameter, iambic trimeter, iambic dimeter, and then one iamb per line. at the very narrowest part of the stanza, and then the stanza opens out again and the lines become broader and broader, fuller and fuller. And what happens if you were to read and pay close attention to the words echo the shape of the poem, in that the beginning of each stanza talks about how man and God are originally together, and so things go well for man. And then after the fall, or after the commission of a sin, things get worse and worse for man until he repents and changes. And in salvation, then things get better and better for him. But I do want to look in some detail at this poem called Prayer 1, which you have in your textbook. And the first thing I draw your attention to is that 14 lines long of cross-rhymed iambic pentameter. What we have here is a sonnet. However, oddly enough, we don't even have a complete sentence in this entire poem. What it consists of is a definition, as one might find in a dictionary. So the term to be defined is prayer, and then what he gives us is a series, a number of different definitions of what prayer is, and some of them are quite profound, and taken all together, this could be a 45, 50, 100-page meditation, if you will, on the importance of prayer. So what is prayer according to Herbert? Well, prayer is the church's banquet. What does one do at a banquet? One gains sustenance by eating, but one also is in fellowship with others. It's a good time. Prayer can do all of that. It can give you sustenance. It can feed you spiritually. It can also be a time in which you join with others. It's the angels' age. What do you suppose the angels did for all of that time before man was created, before they had missions to go on in service to God? We're told that they spent their time in praise and worship of God. God's breath and man returning to his birth, an incredibly profound line. We're told in the book of Genesis that when God created man, he took the clay of the ground and breathed his image into man. So man becomes a living soul when God breathes into him and gives him the breath of life. And in prayer, which when spoken aloud has to be literally breathed out of the mouth, that breath is then returning to God, since prayer is directed to God. So it completes the circle, as it were. It's just magnificent line there. The soul in paraphrase. Paraphrase is putting something into other words. So if you were to record and write down all of your prayers, what we would find is that they discuss the concerns of your soul as it moves through this journey called life. And so your prayers are, in fact, your soul in other words. Your soul's in paraphrase. The heart in pilgrimage, a very similar definition, that you're going on this life through a pilgrimage on a spiritual journey, which will end in salvation and heaven. And all of the prayers along the way to help you toward that goal are a sort of indication, sort of a journal or a diary describing your journey. The Christian plummet, sounding heaven and earth. Plummet, if you'll recall, the chemical symbol for lead is plumbum, Pb, from the Latin word plumbum. Plumbum then was a piece of lead that was attached to a string, and the string was lowered into water in a particularly deep lake, let's say, and then once the lead hit the bottom, then you could make a mark on the string, and then you could measure just how deep that water is. So prayer is something that goes very, very deep indeed. Goes deeper than anything else. An engine against the Almighty. So now he moves to martial or warlike metaphors. An image is a great battle weapon. So prayer, inasmuch as it demands God's attention and it asks God to intervene as much as possible to make something right for us. It demands his attention. It's like a battering ram on the door of heaven. It's an engine against the Almighty. It's the sinner's tower. So if you think about the old medieval times, why people might construct a tower, first of all, to help survey, gives them a high vantage point from which to see all around, helps them gain knowledge and information. So does prayer. It helps one gain a spiritual perspective and deep wisdom. But tower also as a point of strength and protection. So prayer also is a place one goes to when one feels the need of protection. And I call your attention to any number of the Psalms, all of which are prayers to God. Any one of the chapters in the book of Psalms which talk about how God is our shelter and our protection. reversed thunder. So if you think about thunder as God speaking to earth to get our attention, well, prayer is sort of thunder hurled back at God in order to get his attention. It's our speaking to get his attention. Christ side-piercing spear, that at the crucifixion, the centurion shoved his spear into Christ's side to see if he was still alive, and from the wound in Christ's side flowed blood and water. The idea here is that just as that person could make a difference to Christ, could, as it were, penetrate Christ and call his attention to something, so prayer can do the same thing. It can call God's attention to us. The 6 days world transposing in an hour. So the 6 days, Monday through Saturday, you take Sunday off to worship God, but Monday through Saturday you're busy with the cares and concerns of life. Well, what do you do about those cares and concerns of life? You often pray about them. So when you pray about the difficulties and concerns and hardships that you face, that's prayer is that. A kind of tune which all things hear and fear. Tunes can be beautiful, they can be lovely. Things hear them. Again, prayer commands attention, and prayers can be powerful. They can change things. Again, I draw you to the book of Psalms, talking about how God's enemies will be put to flight and so on. So prayer can frighten the evil away. Softness and peace and joy and love and bliss. If the previous 4 lines talked about almost violent images, here also prayer can be soft and can be gentle, can promote joy and love, and can promote bliss. Exalted manna. Remember, manna was the supernatural food that God let down from heaven to feed the children of Israel when they were wandering in the wilderness. So it was a grace that God let down from heaven for human consumption. And so prayer is human beings lifting back up words of praise to God. Gladness of the best, the very best people that you know, enjoy prayer and feel the need for prayer. Gladness of the best, heaven in ordinary. So when you pray, you can be praying on as mundane an occasion as driving to campus, let's say. That can be undertaken. As I say, as you walk across campus, as you're mowing the grass, one can pray. So that's ordinary, but what you're doing is conversing with heaven and meditating on heavenly things. So heaven in ordinary, man well dressed. How can a person be better dressed than when he's addressing God? It's the Milky Way. Prayer is something magnificent and heavenly, like the Milky Way, the bird of paradise, something absolutely magnificent and beautiful. I leave you to look up images on the internet of birds of paradise. Again, they're breathtakingly beautiful. Church bells beyond the stars heard. Remember that in Herbert's day, church bells summoned people to do things. At noon, the Angelus bell would summon people to pray, the prayer called the Angelus. And bells also summoned people to church services. So they call people's attention. So prayer is a church bell that calls God's attention, causes him to direct his attention to us. The soul's blood, the very life of your soul is prayer. The land of spices, again, something beautiful and exotic. And then finally, that wonderful surprise definition at the very end. And George Herbert's poems typically have these nice surprise endings. Something understood, right? That God understands us when we pray. He listens and he understands. Or also, now that we have come to the end of this poem, we understand prayer better because of all of these definitions. So absolutely wonderful tour de force. And I also want to look at his poem, The Windows, talking here about the stained glass windows in a church. Herbert, as we mentioned, was a priest, and so he sets to himself this question: how is it that a weak, frail, sinful man can preach God's holy word? And he comes to the conclusion that a good preacher is like a stained glass window, right? That the stained glass window contains a message, which is the actual figures in the window, a tradition in the medieval church, since very few people could read and almost nobody had Bibles anyway, since they were so incredibly difficult to reproduce. So what people might do while they were in church is look up at the stained glass windows and be reminded of these famous stories from the Bible or from Christianity. And so, but they only work when the light is shining through them. So God's light shining through the preachers then is what makes a preacher truly a good and persuasive preacher. That is to say, the Word of God, the light shining through the person, is memorable and persuasive only when the person himself lives out that Word of God, just as the light shines through those images which are doing something in the stained glass. Lord, how can man preach thy eternal word? He is a brittle, crazy glass. Yeah, crazy here meaning easily broken, flawed. Man, again, George Herbert's humility. As a priest, he is flawed and broken. How can a flawed, broken person manage to expound God's holy word? Right? So maybe the first step is the step of humility, admitting that one isn't great. Yet in thy temple thou dost him afford this glorious and transcendent place to be a window through thy grace. Yet he allows certain people, preachers, in church to have a certain kind of authority in speaking the word of God. But when thou dost anneal in glass thy story, to anneal is to burn colors in the glass, an important part of the process of staining glass. But when thou dost, in the same way that God burns himself and a love for himself into the heart of the preacher. But when thou dost anneal in glass thy story, making thy life to shine within the holy preachers. So if they live out the life, so if the preacher lives out the life of God in his own life, then we take the preacher's words much more seriously. Then the light and glory more reverend grows, and more doth win, which otherwise would show waterish, bleak, and thin, that if the preacher didn't lead a good life, said, do what I say, but not what I do, we wouldn't take him nearly as seriously. But when the preacher lives out what he actually believes, then you take him much more seriously. Doctrine, that is teaching, doctrine and life, colors and light, in one, when they combine and mingle, bring a strong regard and awe. So it's the light shining through the stained glass that's particularly breathtaking. If you've ever gone to Europe and been in the middle of one of these huge cathedrals surrounded by acres and acres of stained glass shining in the broad light of day, colors and light combining into one in the same way that the preacher, his teaching and his own life illustrate what he's saying. Otherwise, he says, speech alone doth vanish like a flaring thing, and in the ear, not in conscience ring. That if the preacher doesn't practice what he preaches, then his words just die in your ear, and you don't take them all that seriously. So a very nicely done poem, I think. They're based on an actual physical object in the church. I want to look also at his poem called The Caller here referring to, but by the way, typical of Herbert's poetry often in that its title can be a bit ambiguous. Collar here meaning the collar that the priest wears around the neck. I might say, by the way, that collar represents slavery. If you, helpful exercise might be to look at all of St. Paul's epistles in the New Testament. This will only take you about 5 minutes to do. Look at the first verse of each of his epistles. What you'll frequently hear him say is Paul, a servant of Christ. What Paul really is writing in the original Greek there is Paulos, doulos Christou, Paul, a slave of Christ. You'll see him say this again and again, and to indicate that is to say that a priest is totally and completely submissive to the will of God. And to indicate that submission, in the Catholic Church and in the Anglican Church, they wear, and sometimes Lutheran churches as well, they wear these collars that suggest the iron collar that you sometimes see depicted around the neck of a slave. So that kind of caller, but also caller, one who calls out, entirely appropriate to this poem because it is a speaker calling out in frustration and anger. And I point out that the word caller, C-H-O-L-E-R, means anger. In Spanish to this day, the word cólera can mean anger. So the title alone is a bit interesting and significant. I struck the board. He slams his fist down on the table. So indeed, we have someone who is angry. I struck the board and cried, no more. So apparently the speaker is not only angry, but he's fed up with something and he no longer wants it. It's been happening to him for a while, and he's tired of it. He wants it to be over with. No more. I will abroad. He's going to escape. He's going to leave. He feels too confined, apparently. He wants to go out into a world of freedom. What, shall I ever sigh and pine? To pine is to long for something you can't have, and to sigh, of course, is to express without words, is to express sorrow or disappointment. Right? You realize, oh, it's 7:45, I've got to get out of bed and come to my 8 a.m. British Lit class, and then you sigh. Much rather stay in bed. Yes, well, this person here is upset, and he has long been, for a long time, he's been longing for something that he doesn't have, and he has been disappointed. My lines in life are free. Free as the road, loose as the wind, as large as store. His lines, that is, his lines of poetry, and you notice that in this poem in particular, there's no consistent rhyme scheme and no consistent rhythmic pattern, so it is a kind of free verse in that way. My lines and life, his lines are free and his life is free, could be freer than it is, and so he wants to take this opportunity to seize his freedom. Shall I be still in suit? To suit is to beg. In our we still use this in a legal sense. We beg the court for some kind of benefit. If I have done you wrong, you can take me to court and beg the court to redress that wrong. But suit also the clerical clothes that a priest wears. Have I no harvest but a thorn to let me blood and not restore what I have lost with cordial fruit? Yes, that you can imagine in George Herbert's day that one of the happiest and most cheerful times of year was harvest, with the harvest celebration, because if you've got a good harvest, you know you're going to survive through the year so that you can survive through the winter. You're going to live another year and make it to the next growing season. But this priest has not been enjoying life, has not been harvesting. He has been slaving away and working away, and he's tired of this. He would like to enjoy the physical pleasures of life for a change. What he's been harvesting to this point is a thorn that just pricks his finger and causes him to bleed. While others are out enjoying life, he has to sacrifice and deny himself. Sure, there was wine before my sighs did dry. Yes, there are pleasures of life, but my sighs, my serious way of life, didn't let me have it. There was corn, that is grain, before my tears did drown it. Once again, he hasn't partaken of the pleasures and joys of life. Is the year only lost to me? Has he wasted only a year? No, the implication is he's lost many years in denying himself the pleasures of life. Have I no bays to crown it? The bay leaf or the laurel branch is what people very often wore as a kind of ceremonial New Year's hat in their time of celebration. He hasn't done that. Do I have no bays to crown the year? No flowers, no garlands gay? All blasted, all wasted? Yes, this has been his life to this point. Not so, my heart, there is fruit. Yes, there is fruit which can be enjoyed, and thou hast hands. You can take your hand and reach for the fruit, pluck it, and enjoy it. Literally seizing the day. This is very much a carpe diem poem, and I hope that you can hear in the Latin phrase carpe, the English word harvest. They're very closely related words in their origin. So to carpe diem literally is a agricultural metaphor, seizing the fruit, harvesting the moment. Seize the day, enjoy life, harvest the moment. Of course, seizing the fruit didn't work so well for Adam and Eve, so we will see. That's what he wants. He wants to enjoy the pleasures of life, even though it's an unpriestly thing to do. Recover all thy sigh-blown age on double pleasures. Leave thy cold dispute of what is fit and not. Forsake thy cage, thy rope of sands, which petty thoughts have made, and made to thee good cable to enforce and draw, and be thy law, while thou didst wink and wouldst not see. A series of lines here that I want to illustrate this. What he's talking about is that the priest has to live a life of more circumspection. He has to live a life of higher morality. Now, when we say the priest we don't see the priest in the liquor store. Is that because buying a beer is wrong? No, it's because he holds himself to a higher standard. I'm reminded of this when I was a graduate student at the University of North Carolina. I had a friend who was a graduate student at Duke University just along the way. Duke, as you may know, is a Methodist school, and he was studying to be a Methodist pastor. And so what he would do in the summers, I would go out in the summers and work in the economy. What he would do is go out in the summers to a small country church that couldn't afford a pastor, and he would be their pastor more or less for free for the summer, and that would be his training. And he and I used to run together. And as you can imagine, a summer day in North Carolina can be almost as hot as it is in rural West Alabama. And so I would often run without a shirt on. He said he wouldn't do that anymore. He used to do that. And one day when he was out in the countryside running near one of his churches, he was running without a shirt on. And you can imagine just what happened. Some little old lady came driving by, was shocked and scandalized to see her preacher running without a shirt on. And so as soon as she got home, she got on the phone and started calling the other people in the church, and pretty soon there was a bit of a scandal and so on. And so he decided from then on he wouldn't run shirtless. Well, is it a sin to run shirtless? No, it's not. But he's developed all of these rules for himself over time that are really nothing. They're a rope of sand. A rope of sand is nothing, and yet over time, by force of habit, it becomes strong cable, and it becomes a cage that imprisons you. And that's what the speaker of this poem objects to. He's developed this whole system of accountability for himself that he finally wants to break free of. And so he repeats himself, "Away, take heed, I will abroad." He is going to leave. He feels too confined in this setting. "Call in thy death's head there." This is the old idea of the memento mori. In fact, in Herbert's day, people might very well carry a skull with them to remind them at every moment when they might be tempted to enjoy the pleasures of life. No, you will die, and so you'd better do the right thing. In fact, George Herbert's good friend John Donne, when he had his professional portrait painted there at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, had himself painted in his death shroud, and that was the official portrait of himself in his study there at the cathedral. And the reason for it is to constantly remind himself that he will die. Now this is too serious as a speaker of this poem. I want to be done with all of this. I want to go out and enjoy life. "Call in thy death's head there, tie up thy fears. He that doesn't do this, he that forbears to suit and serve his need deserves his load." If you don't to look out for number one, then you might as well be stuck in this miserable life. But as I raved and grew more fierce and wild, at every word methoughts I heard one calling child. So God here is calling on him, calls him a child. Why? Because he is indeed a child of God, but also because in pitching this fit, in saying I'm going to run away, he's behaving just like you did when you were 4 or 5 years old and your parents made you mad and you decided you were going to run away from home. It's a very childish way to be. So that's another reason God refers to him as child. And then that wonderful surprise ending at the end of the poem, "And I replied, my Lord." To refer to God as Lord is to refer to him as the one who you obey. And so here, in calling God my Lord, the speaker of the poem finally decides he's not going to run away. He's not going to seize the moment, but he is going to return to his vocation, and he's going to obey God. And the last poem I want to look at is the last poem usually in a collection by George Herbert. This is called Love 3. That means there are, in fact, 3 poems in his collection, The Temple, that have the title Love. This is the third of the 3, and it reminds me very much of that poem by Donne, if you recall, the Hymn to God the Father. That's the poem in which Donne is confessing sin after sin to God. But no matter how sinful Donne is, God is more persistent in forgiving Donne's sins and bringing him to heaven. And the same sort of thing is going on here in Love 3. It's a dramatization. The speaker is a sinner who has been invited to God's feast, and so when he arrives there, he feels out of place. He feels too sinful to be there, and at every objection that he raises about how sinful he is, God answers that objection with a further, more insistent invitation. And so it's a delightful poem in that regard. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. So love, and we're told in John's first epistle that God is love, God has invited the speaker, and yet the speaker, again, this is typical of of Herbert and his humility. He draws back and says, I shouldn't be here, I'm too sinful. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me. So as soon as the speaker of the poem draws back, God follows after him in order to make sure that he stays. Drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. Right? Are we missing something here? Yes. And so what the speaker lacks is a guest worthy to be here. Right? This is what we're missing here. You invited me to this feast, but I'm not worthy. Right? You should have invited someone else. Love said, well, you shall be he. So while the speaker protests that he is not good enough to be there, God responds, no, you are. You should be here. But I, the unkind, the ungrateful, says the speaker of the poem, unkind, of course, meaning not nice, but also in Herbert's day, meaning not the kind of person that should be there. Ungrateful, yes, not thankful, as in modern English, contemporary English, I should say, but also in Herbert's day, literally not full of grace, right? Not full of God's grace. The unkind, the ungrateful, Almighty, I can't even look on you, says Herbert. I'm not worthy even to be in your presence at all. Love took my hand and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? And in case there's any doubt who love is, we now know it's God. He's the one who created Herbert's eyes. Truth, Lord, you did create the eyes, but I have marred them. Herbert has perhaps looked at things that he shouldn't and so damaged his eyes in that way and feels ashamed of that. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. But Christ says, no, you may feel ashamed, but you don't need to anymore because I have taken the blame for that. And know you not, said Love, who bore the blame? So finally, Love is beginning to make some headway with this guest. All right, I will stay here, says the speaker, but at least let me serve. It reminds me a bit of the prodigal son when he finally, having blown all of his money, wakens in that field with the pigs and says, I'm going to go back to my father's house, but maybe he'll accept me as a servant if he doesn't accept me back as a son. Yes, I'll stay here, he says, but I can't possibly be a guest at your feast. Let me be a worker. You must sit down, says Love, and taste my meat. So God, in effect, becomes the server, and the speaker becomes the honored guest. So I did sit and eat. And so the speaker of the poem gives in, showing once again, as in Donne's poem, Hymn to God the Father, that no matter how sinful man is, God is even more persistent in forgiving sin. So we'll end it here for George Herbert. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. And we'll press forward by discussing in a few days the poems of Robert Herrick.